There were several candidates for Game of the Day in a thrilling 7th round of the 2016 British Chess Championship. First up, we had Nick Pert's quick win against Jovanka Huska using the London system. In itself, a mini miracle. David Eggleston beat Keith Arkle in a very exciting game. Then there was Gawain Jones's positional queen sacrifice against Pete Wells. But in the end, only one game really stood out for me, and that was the titanic tussle on board one between the two highest rated players in the tournament, David Howell playing white and Michael Adams playing black. And in itself, this game was important because it featured a theoretical innovation by black. So the game began as a Berlin Rye-Lopez, with white striving mightily to avoid the queenless middle game that arises after Castle's knight takes e4. That's been almost exhausted over the last 16 years, and I imagine white players are getting thoroughly sick of it. So they're trying to find different ways to play. d3, well, that goes back to the days of Steinitz, white playing some sort of slow close formation and hoping to get a small edge, transferring the weight of the struggle to the middle game, as seems to be the norm in modern Grandmaster chess at a high level. Nevertheless, d3 doesn't really interfere with black's development at all, so bishop c5, and now this trendy line, which a lot of the top players are playing, the immediate chop on c6, damaging black's pawn structure. So what we've got here is a kind of exchange Rye-Lopez, with black substituting the move a6 for bishop c5. It's difficult to imagine white can work up a substantial edge with these ideas, but he does keep the game complicated, and that's the main merit of this continuation. I said back to the days of Steinitz. Well, they were playing this position 150 years ago, you know, with white moving this knight to d2, slow manoeuvres the order of the day, and a possible kingside attack in the offing a bit later on, where white starts to push his h-pawn and his g-pawn up the board. Not at all easy to effect this strategy, because it will mean that white's got probably to cast on the queen side, but you know, it injects a bit of life into what is frankly a bit of a colourless position. So Howell played knight bd2. Well, it may be that already at this stage white has got to exercise a bit of precision, and in the game Carlsen versus So, Bilbao 2016, a very recent example of this line, Carlsen played queen to e2. Perhaps that's slightly more precise than knight bd2, because it obliges black to protect this pawn, as So obviously felt, with his queen. And as you'll see in the game, this is perhaps a slightly less convenient arrangement of the pieces for black than what Adams manages to achieve. So white played knight bd2, black castled. White now played queen e2, and black played rook e8. And this looks slightly more comfortable for black because he hasn't committed his queen. So white goes knight c4, attacking the pawn on e5. Black defends. Bishop d2, all as seen before. And now Adams uncorks an interesting novelty. He plays his knight to b6, completely new move. In the game Geary versus So, Leuven 2016, you can see this is a very trendy line among the world's top players. Black played a more traditional defensive move here, bishop d6. White castled on the queen side, and now black put his knight into f8. One of the usual ideas in this line is for this knight to redeploy itself, maybe to e6, eyeing up the squares f4 and d4. That would be a more traditional way to defend the position. Instead, Adam goes knight b6, cheerfully offering white the chance to take that pawn on e5, and this is what makes this innovation so important, and probably why, to date, black players haven't thought of it. Now, it's worth mentioning here that Howell thought for a while, it's not good to take the pawn on e5. If white takes with the knight on c4, then I think f6 is a good move, and that knight on e5 hasn't really got any good place to go. It goes back to c4, we chop it off, and now play bishop f5. And already white's getting into a mess, I would say. I don't think he's better at all. He can't claim anything apart from a disadvantage here. So going back, a better way is knight f e5, and then the computer suggests that bishop d4 is the way to go for black. It's a slightly awkward fork because white's knights are in a bit of a tangle, and black is getting active play. If white goes bishop c3, as suggested by the machine, then the idea is to chop it off, messing up the white pawns, and now to go queen to g5. That's a typical hit in many lines of the open game. Well, once again, black is getting active play. White's best is probably to drop his knight back, and then we chop on g2, rook g1, queen h3. Difficult position arises where white must have some attack on the king side, but at the same time, it's difficult to see him getting this attack together successfully with his king stuck in the middle. So, for instance, after knight e3, black can already consider moves like f5. So, going back to our game, that's probably why Howell played knight e3. He just doesn't want to give Mickey the initiative at this early stage. And black continues his quest for the initiative by playing a5, whereupon white responds in a like manner with h4. So, tit for tat, with a5, black's trying to make white's king think about castling long. And with h4, white is saying, well, you know, I'm sounding the charge. You know, if you're going to put your king on g8 early, I'm going through with my plan. Of course, white could castle short, and then we get a completely different type of game. But even there, I think black chances are pretty satisfactory. So h4, Howell is very brave. Bishop comes into d4. Again, you know, trying to talk white out of casting on the queen side. For instance, if he plays c3, the queen side is a little bit more tender than it was. Probably black would take off the knight and go bishop g4, again with satisfactory chances. But once white's played h4, the pin on g4 is a little bit awkward, and now white's got a weakness on d3 to consider. So Howell, again, uncompromising as ever, he castles on the queen side. Mickey plays bishop e6, attacking a2, king b1, and now pawn up to f6. So we have a genuinely interesting position on our hands, which is the main reason why this variation is popular. The players have castled on opposite sides, and it's all to play for. And Howell continues with his very brave strategy by playing g4. And that is a genuine pawn sacrifice, because white can now wonder what happens if black takes on e3 and takes on g4. I mean, there were other ways to play this position. White could have just played h5 and tried to do it without sacrificing a pawn, or he could have put his knight on f5, and that's quite a strong piece. So black's probably got to take it off. White recaptures a4, a3. That's probably necessary. Queen d7, and now g4. This was another way the game could have gone. Perhaps I slightly prefer this to the game for white, because you know, he doesn't have to sacrifice a pawn, and at the same time he still gets some sort of pressure. But black also has obviously good chances after a move like b5. It's just a very sharp position. So white goes g4, and after some thought, Mickey actually accepts the pawn sacrifice. He takes on e3. He considers this is his best chance to win. Well, white doesn't want to be pinned there by the bishop on g4, so he takes with the queen, bishop g4, and now white hits the bishop. Mickey takes off the knight, queen takes, and now king to h8. Queen to g3, threatening mate, rook to e7, protecting, and now pawn up to f4. So this is a logical continuation of the pawn sacrifice. It's clear that black's got to be very careful. White's piling down there on the king side, and black's initiative on the queen side seems to have ground to a halt. Well, there was another way. White could have obviously played h5. He obviously feels he needs to get to grips with the initiative without delay, hence f4. But this does allow black a nice trick, and that's knight to c4. Tarash said that a knight on b6 is always badly placed. Mickey Adams challenges the great man's words as he brings this knight back into play with knight c4. And I think this is just a very good move, because as we'll see, that knight is headed for e5 in the ensuing play. So white goes bishop c1. Well, he could have put the bishop on e3. After that, I dare say black would have taken on f4. And Howell probably didn't do this because he didn't want his queen to be decoyed off the g file. But at the same time, white's got his bishop on c3. So again, this is a difficult position to call, for instance, after queen d6, queen f2, knight e5, h5. Well, you'll just have to make your own comparison with this position and what happens in the game. So Howell goes bishop c1, Mickey takes on f4, bishop takes, and now knight to e5. And Howell, perhaps reluctantly, takes off that knight. He can't see another way to keep his initiative on the boil without removing the knight. Black must take with f-pawn, rook to f1. Queen comes up to d6, and now white brings his rook into f5. Pawn up to a4, white's probably got to stop that pawn, and now b5. So a battle for the initiative is in full swing. You know, white is trying to maintain a kingside attack. Black is pushing forward on the queen side, trying to open up lines himself. The extra pawn, because there's no passed pawn on the board, doesn't necessarily matter at the moment, but it could matter the longer the game goes on. So white has got to be pretty careful here to be accurate. Well, he first of all threatens mate. Black defends against the mate. And now white can find nothing better than king c1, whereupon black goes c5. And it's about this stage that black starts to take over the game. Position's probably still equal, but you know, from a point at which white seemed to be attacking, it's now black who seems to be the one playing for a win. Added to which, Howell was getting into his usual difficult situation on the clock. Not an easy position to play this with black continually threatening to prise open the white king. So of course Mickey knows exactly what he's doing in these positions. He first of all puts the brakes on the white attack, cutting out h6 for good. Rook g1, perhaps threatening rook g6, so black stops that as well. The rook comes into the 7th rank, and now b takes a3, b takes a3, c4, opening up an attack against a3. These major piece endgames quite often feature a serious battle for the initiative, and c4 is an excellent move because after d takes c4, black's got no obvious way of regaining his pawn. Instead, he's going for coordination and counter-attack. So rook f6, another excellent move. Well, now it has to be said that, you know, if white starts taking off the pieces, he starts to feel the ragged nature of his pawn formation. So after rook d8, king b2, let's say rook d4, black is really getting his act together. And white is being thrown right onto the defensive. Howell doesn't like that. Going back to the game, he attacks the black queen. The queen retreats. And now rook to f1. Flagged up by the machine as a possible mistake. But again, with white in pretty serious time trouble at this point, you know, this move is understandable. He wants to maintain control of the file. The machine's showing me rook d1 and just allowing black to get 2 rooks for the queen. It's obviously hoping that the queen can go on the rampage, something like this. Well, I dare say most players would prefer to be black, but the white queen's pretty strong here, and black's got to be a bit careful because there are certain endgames when the queen comes down and whips off this pawn. Queen and passed pawn could keep the rooks at bay. You can understand why Howell doesn't go for that. He plays rook f1, and Mickey took on f7. Again, the machine is showing rook takes f1 check and queen h4 is more precise. That's splitting hairs, as the way black plays it is pretty effective. He takes and plays c6, and now white plays king to b2, and it's probable that this is a mistake. More precise, I think, here was the immediate rook b7. That prevents the black rook from creating threats on the b file. Black's best after that is probably rook f8 and only now king b2. The difference is that after king b2 now, queen to d1 is an excellent move because it not only threatens rook b8 check, it threatens to whip off that pawn on h5, and that's the problem for white. He's got to cover his king, but unfortunately now he loses his h-pawn. And that's a big pawn to lose, because in the endgame, as we'll see, the h-pawn is going to be black's winning trump. So having made that mistake, I think from now on it becomes increasingly difficult for white to hold this position. But Howell comes up, as he always does, with a fighting move, an audacious king march up the board, bearing the king to the attack of the black pieces. And this is a very interesting way to play the position. Queen takes c2 was answered by queen takes e5, and now queen to d3, whereupon king b6 was played, a continuation of the same audacious march. Well, white's trying to include his king in the game. It's as simple as that. And he may well have been rewarded for his bravery if he played rook b8 here. This was, I think, the best move. And now I think it's difficult for black to win this position. If he takes on a3, I think it's pretty straightforward. We go takes, takes, and queen e6 check. And I think that forces a draw by perpetual check. More challenging after rook b8 is to take it, because that drags the white queen to a less effective square. But all the same here, e5 gives dangerous chances to white. And it could well be a draw. I mean, if, for instance, black goes h5, which looks like a good move, queen to b4, queen to d5, king to b6, takes, takes. And white's c-pawn is going to give him some chances in this endgame. Going back to e5, black can try a check and another check, but then king c7. And this doesn't really help black, as he can't exchange queens. That would be really foolish. In fact, white wins this position. So rook b8 was an interesting try here. Howell plays king b6. There's an exchange of pawns. Queen to d3. Only now rook to b8. Slightly worse timing, and the problem is now that you know, this a pawn is an issue. The queen comes back to e5. Queen a6 check. And now the a pawn gets on the march, and that drives white passive. Amazing how the black queen is covering all the key squares. So c6, he's got to try something. Queen b5 check, king d6, and now Mickey's calculated this all out. He transposes into yet another queen ending. 2 against 1 on the same side, but crucially, with the black king completely safe. So this endgame is problematic for white. Well, I think he's probably lost. Can't get his king back into the position to play against the h-pawn, and that's a good move. For instance, Howell played king to d5. I mean, that's understandable. If he goes queen c2 here, we go queen f6 check, and then start the march. I think this is the problem for white. That h-pawn's coming down the board. If he goes queen e6, queen f6, king d5, and again h5. And I think this is actually losing for white. So king to d5 was played. Queen to a2 check. King to e5. And now again with all the squares covered, black plays h5. Black handles this endgame with customary efficiency and accuracy. So the first plan is to keep the king safe. Queen comes back to guard all the squares, and now push the passed pawn. And I don't think now there's very much that poor David Howell can do about it, because he really can't stop the h-pawn long term. So king e4, queen g4, check king e5, h3, just a good move. Queen f2, queen h5, queen h2, trying to blockade queen h4, tightening the noose, running white out of moves. The plan is to manoeuvre the queen to g2, clearly. So queen c2, queen g5, there's a repetition. Queen f2, if queen h2 there, then we do play queen g2. So queen f2, g6, why not? King d4, queen takes f5, and now it's, of course, completely gone. So the game finished. Queen g3, g5. There are a few checks, Queen B7, King H5, King E3, H2, Queen H1, Queen F4 check, King E2, inexorable advance of the pawns, Queen D5 check, King H4, Queen D8 check, King G3. And after 77 moves of this really excellent fighting game, White had to resign. So full credit to both players there on a game worthy of the board one top board clash between the two highest rated players, and in the end a tremendous victory for Mickey Adams.